Dr. Molefi Asante, chairman of the African American Studies Department at Temple University and author of Afrocentricity.
I mean,
Okay.
that's right.
Just happened to be black. Give me your comment on that.
Pathetic. Because you can't be no other if you're African. You can't, there is no just happen to be.
Why do you think that is said?
Well, you know, what happens is that you get these writers, particularly an artist, who once, and I've seen this a number of times, are musicians, and someone says, well, you know, you are really an outstanding African-American musician. And the person says, well, I just happen to be black, I'm a musician. Well, but you were black before you were a musician. You were an African-American before you were a writer, or before you were an artist. Your fundamental reality is the African reality. And all the other things that come after birth, of course, are things that one acquires. I mean, but essentially, we are African people. And for an African person to say that is also an admission of an inferiority complex. Because it is rare that you would hear, for example, a Jewish writer say, I just happen to be Jewish. You don't do that. I mean, there's no reason for that. The only reason for that is because of a sense of inferiority, that you feel that you've got to make other people believe that I'm good, yes, I'm good.
And I'm universal.
And I'm universal. But of course, there are no humans apart from their culture. All human beings exist with culture. And sometimes African Americans believe you can't be black and human.
You are at Temple University. How would you describe the attitude that African American students have regarding African history?
Well, it's probably not much different from the attitudes at other campuses, but maybe a little bit more positive. And I'm
not just talking about Temple so much, but just generally speaking.
Well, generally speaking, I think that the attitude that African Americans have toward African history students now, I think that the attitude is much better than I've seen it in a long time. And the reason for that has been that there have been a number of informal workshops, symposia, seminars, lectures. There are tapes that are disseminated around the country. So we're getting a student population that has been exposed to many more things in terms of our history than before. And so I think that there's a growing consciousness and awareness.
The African American students going to a predominantly African American college with a teacher that does not try to help him get centered on African history, African culture, is doing what to him?
It's betraying him. It's a shame. It's a disgrace. In fact, this is one of the other points that I have made recently. It is a shame and a disgrace that African American colleges have been so slow to adopt Afrocentric positions. The student demonstration at Howard University simply indicated one thing. When those students began to demonstrate and say, we want an Afrocentric curriculum, I was so happy for them, because I said to myself, they ought to have had always an Afrocentric curriculum. But the university has never adopted a position that sees African knowledge as central. It is adopted a Eurocentric model. And a Eurocentric model means that African knowledge becomes peripheral knowledge, when in fact it should be centered. The literature department ought to be centered on African writers, on African American writers. European writers should be on the periphery of such a department. If you're going to make African-centered education responsive to the demands of the 21st century, we've got to do that. The history department should have history courses that are centered first on ancient African history, modern African history, intermediate African history, African American history, Africans in the diaspora in the Caribbean and the South America, I mean, that should be the center of a history department in a predominantly black institution. I mean, these things really agitate me because when you go to a black college and they say to you, we teach Russian here, we teach Spanish here, we teach French here, and you say to them, do you teach Yoruba? Do you teach Swahili? And they say, oh no, we won't have any students who would be interested in those courses. Then you have to think that there is something fundamentally, profoundly wrong with predominantly black institutions.
Which were established to...
Well, you want to lead me into something?
No,
here,
I'm
right?
just asking. I'm not finished. I'm just asking questions.
Which was,
These institutions were established primarily to...
They were established for different reasons, of course. I mean, some were established mainly as training grounds for the children of the masters that they had with slave women. Enslaved African women, and those children went to certain schools. Some were established to train Native Americans and African Americans in how to fit into the economy of the U.S. Others were started as religious schools, et cetera, et cetera. But fundamentally, what has happened in two instances, and I mentioned that instance particularly of what has happened in terms of the curricula of these colleges and universities, is that they have not turned, there's not one that's Afrocentric. In other words, I wrote an article last year, or 2 years ago, on the Afrocentric University, which is widely disseminated in Africa, because I contended that there's not one Afrocentric university in the United States or on the continent of Africa. Does not exist. Now, that's one of the problems. The second problem is that when these institutions were established, they were established essentially without, with the philanthropists not allowing them to establish publishing houses or presses, which meant that the books that they used were not written by their professors, or if they were written, they were not published by those universities. Most major universities in America have presses. I think only one or maybe two of our universities or colleges have presses. But this is incredible, because what it means is that we have not created, with 120 colleges, we have not created a broad reading public in terms of with 35 million people, and if we had 1 million of our people reading regularly and passing books and trading books and giving books as gifts that are published by our presses, by the university presses or college presses, we would have an enormous degree of consciousness. But these universities and colleges were prevented from establishing these presses many times by philanthropists, but also by their own inability to see the vision.
Now let us clarify. What is Afrocentricity, and what are some steps that must be taken to get us thinking and behaving Afrocentrically?
Well, Afrocentricity, again, is simply when the African person begins to see the world through a frame of reference that is centered on that person's historical experiences. And if you see the world that way, if someone, for example, says to you, who is the most outstanding person in American history? It would seem to me that an Afrocentric person would probably want to say somebody like Harriet Tubman. I mean, that's just coming out of your historical experiences. You couldn't say, you see, on the other hand, you couldn't say out of that experience that Thomas Jefferson was the greatest person in American history if you're Afrocentric. Or, for example, if someone says, well, I mean, what about white people? Then you say, well, maybe John Brown. Because what you're doing, you are interpreting now reality from your own center. That's important. Africans have rarely done that in this country, and they have not done it simply because of the tremendous impact of the media on our consciousness. Now, what are some steps? I think there's some very practical steps. The first thing I would do, if I were a person who wanted to be on this road, would simply be to take the space that I'm in. If you're living in a home or in an apartment, or you have a church or a mosque or what have you, began to Afrocentricize it in terms of motifs. Simply say, go out, and say, I'm going to now buy some kente cloth or some African fabrics. I'm going to Afrocentricize it. If you are a book collector, say, I'm going to now start collecting also African American books and African books. In your home, demonstrate an Afrocentric consciousness by purchasing the artworks of African artists. Many African American artists, some of the greatest artists in the world, live among us. And yet African Americans go and purchase $9.99 reproductions of European artists for their homes. You can't, see, you have to begin to take a sense of consciousness. We wouldn't normally, this is why we said earlier, we wouldn't normally have to deal with this question if we had not had the bombardment of 500 years of cultural dislocation.
But white Americans, the European world, has this discussion, but in what form?
Well, I mean, the discussion of...
Discussion in terms of how to keep themselves centered.
Well, essentially what happens in the European world is that all of the dominant media, educational institutions, the churches, camps, seminars, military academies, all of these things are arrayed in order to keep the culture reinforced. And so one almost gets it by osmosis. I mean, simply, it's in the air. In other words, you don't have to ask yourself who Shakespeare is. I mean, you don't even have to know anything about Shakespeare to know Shakespeare or to have heard Shakespeare's name. But to hear Langston Hughes' name, you have to do extra work. And for an African American, that presents sometimes a problem. But I'm just saying that those are the differences, that in a sense, the society itself reinforces European culture.
So there's no need necessarily to write Eurocentricity.
No, because everything is Eurocentric. You see, the whole thing is that essentially, this is the question like that we often have sometimes with African American studies at universities. People say, why should there be African American studies if there is not white studies? Well, everything else is white studies. Whether it's political science, called sociology, or called economics, it all is white studies. And what you are affirming are white intellectuals in those departments. And so the need is different because, in a sense, the whole dominant culture, the whole majority society is essentially one of reaffirming the myths out of that culture. So one knows the golden fleece and the holy grail. All of this is right in the movies. I mean, it comes right out of the culture. But yet, African images, the images of Shaka and Pianki and Taharka and Shabaka and Shabataka, Zulu and Zenzakona, Luzimani, Bazilikazi, Nzinga, you see, Ya Asantewa. These are images that exist and occur in our historical experiences, but they are never brought to the fore. So consequently, our people don't know them, neither do the whites know them, but the whites don't care about knowing them, you see, because they are presenting their own worldview. And they are not, of course, stopping to say, oh, but there is another idea here, or there are other ideas. We must do that.
Several quotes. Time is getting short. Every time an African achieves heroic stature in defense of our people, you say, someone labels her or him a Moses.
That is because of the Christian notion. The whole idea is that people see it somehow as, I call it the Messianic notion. The idea that somehow the person who is achieving is somehow a deliverer, somehow a liberator, when in fact that person is simply no more than a reflection of the mass of the people. That, as Sweet Honey and the Rock used to sing a song about Biko, in which they say, okay, there's Biko, but I see 10,000 Bikos arising, you see? And I think that that's what we need to begin to see, is that there are 10,000 of these people. We don't have to say Moses either, of course.
And what does that do in terms of moving the African American from that African center?
This is why I say we don't have to call the person Moses. We can call the person Shaka. I mean, the point is that what happens is that Moses moves you off of center. Because, of course, what you are participating therein is really a Jewish culture. You identify your leaders as with Jewish history. So when you say somebody is a black Moses, and this is what you read in the literature sometimes, what you're really doing is you are actually disemboweling the African historical experiences, taking it out and putting that person in the form of someone else's culture. You are simply saying that the African person cannot stand alone. And if the African person can stand alone, then you should find the examples and the motifs out of that culture, out of that history.
Another quote. What kind of salad dressing do you prefer?
Nigerian.
What happened to French?
Well, that's a Eurocentric imposition on my consciousness. And I think that what happens is that essentially, if you take food, this is why I say, you see, the Europeans use everything. Whether it is how you name foods, whether it is how you choose place names, even in the African continent. When the Europeans went to Africa, they said, okay, you may have called this Harare, we're going to call it Salisbury. In other words, I'm saying that everything in our consciousness is continually bombarded. So the African assumes that French or Russian or Italian are the names of.
But you're saying that it's fine for them to use it.
Well, essentially, there is nothing wrong with a Eurocentric perspective for Europeans. That is natural. What the problem becomes is when Africans do not have an Afrocentric perspective, and when the Europeans do not allow space for the Afrocentric perspective to be a co-perspective.
This city is like a jungle, if you can remember that from your book.
This city is like the steppes of Russia.
Why? Explain that.
Well, because I think the jungle, or forest particularly, quite frankly, jungle doesn't exist in Africa, but the rainforest, but people think it does, and so when they use that image, cities like a jungle, they have these images of Africa and the difficulties that people might have in Africa, but Africans live in the rainforest, and it's not an inhospitable place.
But in the steppes, the Eurasian steppes you're referring to?
Yeah, sure, of course. That may be inhospitable, but the European rarely uses that as a symbol. You see what I'm saying?
Why do you say the steppes were...
Well, because the steppes may be very difficult, cold, and unfriendly to us.
No, I mean, why was the steppes an unfriendly place to
the African?
Okay.
To the African would be an unfriendly place, cold and hostile.
Okay.
You see. But I'm saying that the African image, the African can't write, this is like a jungle.
What was happening in the Eurasian steppe? That's what I'm getting at.
Well,
in terms of how the
the Viking behavior, the Viking destruction, and the Vandals, and all of this kind of thing in terms of people destroying things.
The word imagination means what, you say?
Well, I mean, I've used this meaning of this word actually in conjunction with what might be called sciencing, which was a system of wording that came actually out of the Moorish movement. And I call imagination the image of a nation.
Can you give me some more on that?
Well, it's simply, it's a part of sciencing. You know, when we say community,
Image a nation.
when we say community, we say community means unity. That is the sciencing technique that comes out of the Moorish movement. So imagination, I said, one could look at imagination, particularly in an Afrocentric sense, as an image of a nation.
If we, as African Americans and Africans around the world, reach for Afrocentric awareness, what is the prognosis for our future in terms of your eyes, and what is the prognosis if we don't?
Well, the prognosis for our future, if we do, is one in which African people will assume their rightful place in world history, and we will reclaim the place we once had in world history as a mature and independent and autonomous people. If we do not, we will remain vestiges of a declining civilization. We will also remain people who are on the periphery of someone else's culture, lost, unable to find ourselves. Our posterity will be further lost, confused, and in effect destroyed psychologically, economically, and culturally.
Final question. Talk, if you will, about the importance of the mind, the role the mind will play in helping African Americans and Africans around the world becoming free, and the need for African American parents, African parents, to capture the minds of their children at an early age.
When the child is 3 or 4 years old, the parents should, having already begun, but should then redouble their efforts to capture the mind of African American children. Those children ought to be, in fact, immersed in African culture, with African motifs, with African fabrics, with African rites and rituals. The Afrocentric rites of passages should be planned for them so that when they are 13, 14, or 15, or 16, that they go through these rites of passages, naming their ancestors and the ancestors from the continent, being able to demonstrate that they are valuable people, parts of the community. These things should happen very early because the mind is very important. And the collective conscious will of the people can only bring this about in terms of the efforts of African Americans to be free mentally and culturally and in every way through the will of the people. But the will must be important and is important. And the African American parents have got to just grab those children and immediately begin to indoctrinate them with culture.
Because if you don't, someone else will.
Oh, if you don't, certainly they will be indoctrinated. I mean, that is for sure. I mean, television will do it, media will, other media will do it. It will be done, and we will have again a lost generation.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
It is my pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right.
Imhotep.
And so we can see from a long time ago, the Lord didn't bring us this far to leave us. But we have reached a point in our history where we have some fundamental failures. Too many of us have become too successful, and it has blurred our memories. 2 cars in the driveway and the home in the suburbs somehow blurs our memory. Now, I don't tell you don't get your 2 cars. Go right ahead. Buy American. I don't tell you don't get the nice home. Go right ahead. But in the getting of those material things, do not lose your souls or your memories. A friend of mine not long ago, talking with some students at Howard University, and they were interested in doing for their community, and she said, don't bother to think of doing for black people. That's not important. Go out and do the best that you can with your life. Make the best money you can. Achieve all of those things that you individually want to achieve, and other people will see you as a role model and follow. And I think it is a sad thing that that friend failed to understand that the strength of the black community is the extended family. It is not the individual always sent forth. It is the individual connected to the group and understanding that as a family we are strong, and as individuals we will wither and die on a poorly fed vine. That has to be understood. And then after we understand that, we must understand we must not be provincial. Now here comes the trick. Lots of people talk to me thinking that when Max talks about the black community, when he talks about the family, and when he talks about the history, that I would suggest we stay in one corner of this world. Not so. I believe that we must go forth and do those things that all great people must do, and make our contribution to this entire world, not just black people. We must never think of ourselves as one little corner of the world. It was Dr. King who taught us that it is not simply civil rights, it is human rights all across this globe that we must work for. But we must save ourselves first. We must start by loving ourselves individually and collectively. Because only by ridding ourselves of a terrible self-hatred that has existed for many a year, and we still do hate ourselves, only by ridding ourselves of this cancer can we hope to love anyone. You see, a person who hates him or herself can love no one else. And so we must start to understand we are as good as anyone in this world and are better than no one. But no one is better than we. Recently, I talked about the need for media as flawed mirrors in this country to be corrected. Some of you may know about that. I was the center of a controversy. And I will say right now that only by talking about the illnesses of our society can we hope for good health. You cannot imagine it away. You cannot bury it. You cannot sweep it under the carpet or hide it in the closet. You must cure the illness by exposing it. And the fact is, the media in our country fail every day to reflect large segments of this society, and I'm referring to people of color. And so I will say now, the media are flawed mirrors of America. If we are to reflect our country, we must reflect all of our country, and I will not rest, I will not stop, I will not be shut up until I have made my contribution to that effort.
In 1991, a popular priest, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, became the first democratically elected president of Haiti, inspiring hope for an end to the nation's suffering.
If we look at Haitian people, we can say it's a holy people. The way they die for democracy.
The Story of Haiti, Dreams of Democracy, Thursday at 10 on WHMM.
My best friend at school.
A production of South Carolina ETV.
Good evening and welcome to For the People and the second part of our conversation with Dr. Ramona Edelin, President of the National Urban Coalition. We continue our discussion of the importance of providing a cooperative learning environment for students.
Moreover, a cooperative learning environment takes you out of that old bell curve mentality where in order for me to make an A, you have to make a C. In this classroom, we're all on a team. We're all on the same team. We may compete in a friendly way with someone else down the street, but in here, our attitude is we're all going to make it. We're all going to succeed, and we're going to work on this set of problems until each and every person in here can excel and achieve in that. And there's another key to that outside of the classroom, which is very important. Turns out from two recent studies, one from California and one from Massachusetts, the single defining characteristic for the Asian students who excel so much, particularly in the technology areas, are the study groups that they form after school. And this is the cooperative learning environment, the team spirit, the adult leader who takes them through what they've done that day, make sure that everybody has it. When they go back to class the next day, they're ready. They know they're ready. This is missing in the lives of our children.
But with this culture so caught up into individualism,
Mm-hmm.
how do you think people will be able to break through that?
Individualism is a cruel lie. I will be as blunt as I can be about this. And I think Du Bois said it very well when he said, the history of the world is a history of races, groups, not individuals, and not nations. We are in an environment that pretends, and here's where the language structure and the whole set of expectations tells again. It pretends to be about rugged individualism, but in fact, groups emerge or do not emerge. There is one reason why the whole African group en masse cannot rise up right now, and that is, as a group, we are discriminated against, which is not to say we don't have a few brilliant entrepreneurs and others who can rise to the surface. But the reason that we are concerned about the uplift of the masses of our people still in 1989 is that we as a group defy the myth of the ethnic queue. Everybody else may have been able to step up that way. We have not, and there are reasons for that have to do with our identity as a group. We must get away from that individualism thinking, which is not to say that the individual's rights and talent and genius are not to be cherished and developed. But it's developed how? In a context.
I almost want to push you to say some more about this. It's very interesting. See?
In a context. The context is a cultural one. Culture is the vehicle that moves all human groups forward. It is your total way of life, your intentions, what you believe in, what you reward, what you punish, how you raise your children, why you want to recycle the monies that goes through our hands like water back into your community. It answers the question of why and how. Our culture, as we know, was cruelly and systematically stripped during 250 years of the African slave trade. It's up to us now to put it back together in a very self-conscious and mature way. Not to exclude others, not to victimize others. We have never as a people been about that, but to develop ourselves. We can't sit at the table of cultures with the rest of the peoples of the world until we develop our own culture. Now, the reason that this American and African, African and American two-ness, as Du Bois called it, is so poignant right now and has so much immediacy right now for us is, how do you rebuild your culture without resolving a problem of your basic identity, which is where we are
I don't even want you to go to that because I'm saving that.
Okay.
I know where you're going with that.
Yes, all right.
I want you to save that.
All right.
Let's go to your program. Say yes to a youngster's future.
To a
You tell us
youngster's
about
future.
that.
Say yes
And
to
we're
a
going to show
youngster's future.
this bad tape that's going to follow. Go ahead.
Okay, well, in a nutshell, Say Yes to a Youngster's Future is a family learning program based both in schools and in communities, which focuses on math and science and technology and those areas where we are so underrepresented and underprepared, and which are the workplace of the 21st century, well, of now, but certainly of the 21st century, where we are so lacking. It uses these methodologies and learning styles that I spoke of, as well as placing them in a cultural context. And it's being implemented now in 24 elementary schools, serving children who have great need and their families and their teachers. We retrain teachers. We help families and other good church folks and volunteers to develop these hands-on methods and the science and math content and this cooperative learning environment that I've been speaking about. And we see beautiful qualitative as well as quantitative results in the children, the teachers, and the parents.
How do you get to the teachers, parents, and the students? How do you get them involved?
We get to the students by means of the schools, and we work through superintendents who select schools and principals who will be able to put a strong program together. Parents are involved.
Strong program together where? Is it in the public school system or this is a separate place?
No, it's in the public school systems in Houston, Washington, and going into New Orleans this year for the first time. We train the teachers intensively in the summer. They build these techniques and this content into their curriculum. You know, very few of our teachers in public schools in the elementary grades are competent or feel confident about teaching mathematics, let alone science. And so we give them much more in the way of confidence, actual materials that they can use, and train them in the use of those materials. And there's a required parental involvement component in the way of a Saturday program. And how you get parents out has been a very interesting process. You're talking about parents, very often single parents, who work at night. How do you get them up on a Saturday morning to come out with the children? And we've gone through many, many lessons in that. But we've got to the point now where as many as 200-300 families can be going on a field trip on a given Saturday, or to hear Colonel Guy Bluford, the astronaut, at the Air and Space Museum with the children, or to the Children's Museum in their city, the zoo, or coming in to hear role models and scientists and people who have motivational as well as content to bring to the children in these Saturday programs. But the key turned out to be personal contact, one-on-one from other parents who just were willing to go and knock on doors and say, this is free, this is the future for our children, plus it's a whole lot of fun. We went last week and last month, and you really ought to come out.
Now, can people around the country get tied into this program?
I would very much like to be, you know, Listervelt, I can't name them for you on the program, but there are 25 districts, public school districts, where the vast majority of our children are educated, just 25. It is my hope that Say Yes to a Youngster's Future will be in all 25 of those districts, at least at the elementary and preschool level, by 1990, 1991. This would make an enormous difference in the preparedness of the children, the teachers, and the families. It's a simple formula, but it works because it has that cultural integrity that we're talking about, as well as being technically sound and based in the best of the research. The teachers are crazy about it. They say it feels like Christmas when they get their new material. You know, a lot of our teachers are paying for their pens and paper out of their own pocketbooks, let alone getting new innovative math and science, hands-on discovery materials to use with the children. So it's a boon. It's a boon to public education.
I'm not going to ask you for an address now because we'll provide one at the end of this
series.
But you have a videotape that we want to look at. Would you mind setting it up for us?
Okay. Please? We did with the National Black Leadership Roundtable, which is a group of 300 and more organizations associated with the Congressional Black Caucus. They have set up a science technology group within them that we have been asked to run. And together with that group, which is called SMART, we've produced a 15-minute video geared to African American adults to explain to them the importance of math and science, the crucial nature of our getting our children better prepared in math and science, and the fact that you are continuing a great African tradition when you continue in mathematics and science. We're not aliens in somebody else's land when we do math and science. We gave the world mathematics and science, and Colonel Frederick Drew Gregory, who just returned from the latest shuttle safely, thank God, narrates this particular video for us.
This is November 28th, 1989. Okay.
All right.
And he just got back, what, yesterday?
Yesterday, I think, last night.
Right. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so we'll take a look at the tape.
Is this the dawn of a new age or the sunset of a people? Will we be remembered as the generation that took up the challenge, or the generation that surrendered the future for fear of science and mathematics?
Hello, I'm Colonel Frederick Drew Gregory. In 1984, I had the honor of becoming the first black American astronaut to pilot a NASA space shuttle. It was an experience which convinced me that all the years I'd spent in preparation were worth it. I'm proud to have made a contribution to America's space program, and I'm continuing my work with NASA as we develop the computers and other technologies needed for the future. The space program is only one of the many paths leading into our high technology future. But I'm concerned about the plain fact that there are just too few black Americans involved in the world of science and technology. And it's primarily because the vast majority of us don't study science and math, disciplines which were born and developed in Africa. The history of science began with the domestic use of fire in Africa, the birthplace of the first humans. A million years later, African people began to cultivate the earth, and the science of agriculture was born. Women's observations of the cycles of the moon led to the development of calendars, which were used to predict the times for planting and harvesting crops. The ancient Egyptians left the eternal reminder of African mastery of mathematics and engineering, the Great Pyramid of Khufu and mammoth temples, which even after 6,000 years are still wonders of the world. It was Imhotep, recorded history's first multi-genius, who was the architect of the first pyramids, as well as the father of medicine, a philosopher, astronomer, magician, and poet. Imhotep's brilliance was not unique in ancient Egypt. This model glider is thought by some to be a replica of a full-size airplane, which indicates that the Egyptians may have studied elementary aeronautics more than 2,000 years ago. Here's an example of algebraic calculations used in Egyptian problem solving 3,000 years ago. Central Africa was the birthplace of the Iron Age. Recent discoveries show that as long as 2,000 years ago, Africans in the area of Tanzania produced the world's first carbon steel. If we speed forward through time, we can find the first African-American man of science, Benjamin Banneker, who was a self-taught mathematician, astronomer, and engineer. Even during the days of slavery, African Americans were inventing machines which proved useful to the nation, such as Norbert Rilliot's sugar refining device and Henry Blair's seed planter. Blair was the first African American to be granted a U.S. patent. He was lucky. A man who was a slave on Jefferson Davis's plantation invented a propeller for ocean vessels, but he couldn't secure a patent because he was a slave. With emancipation, there was an explosion of patents granted to such black American inventors as Elijah McCoy, Granville Woods, Jan Metzelliger, Lewis Latimer, Sarah Boone, Garrett Morgan, and Madam C.J. Walker, to name just a few. George Washington Carver revolutionized the economy of the South and the world through his research and uses of agricultural products to develop the synthetic industry. Great benefits have also derived from the work of research scientists such as Ernest Everett Just, Charles Turner, Percy Julian, Charles Drew, Lloyd Hall, George Carruthers, Jane Wright, and Christine Darden. We've just seen a few of the brightest stars in the galaxy of Africans and African Americans involved in science and technology. The door to high-tech careers is ajar today because of the hard work of our forebears, who were willing to take risks and overcome the odds. But at a time when research in robotics, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and genetic engineering are leading mankind into a new wave of civilization, the masses of African Americans are pitifully unprepared to fully participate in the future.
Today, for the first time in human history, everyone must know some math and science in order to be productive. It is not enough for a few bright stars to shine. People will find that jobs will not be available as secretaries, as automobile mechanics, even in fast food restaurants, without requiring some interaction with high technologies. Children who today are in the second grade will be society's throwaways in 15 years if they don't master the disciplines required in the information age. Those of us who were trained in reading, writing, and arithmetic should realize that in addition to the 3 R's, today our children must consider science, mathematics, and computer technology as basic necessities, beginning in preschool and continuing throughout their lives.
We're back. I love that tape.
Thank
But it's only about 6 minutes we showed.
Right.
Yeah, it's about, what, 15 minutes or so?
Yes, but about half of it was shown.
Okay, and it...
The rest deals with what courses you need to take. This is crucial. 80% of our children are automatically disqualified from high technology jobs if and when they finish high school. For one reason, they have not taken the courses that you have to take to prepare for math and science. Math and science are building blocks. You cannot wake up one morning in your 11th or 12th grade year and decide you want to be an engineer or a physicist. If you haven't had algebra and geometry and calculus and physics, you cannot do it. And so one of the purposes of this piece is to tell our adults, look, be on the case where the children are concerned. If the counselors are discouraging them, if their teachers are discouraging them from taking these courses, you step in and you make sure that they at least have the option. Everybody's not going to be a scientist or a mathematician, but make sure they at least have the option because they took the courses at the proper time and in the proper sequence to enable them to do that. And that's pretty much what the rest of the film does.
And this tape is available?
Yes, it's available.
We'll provide the address later on.
All right.
Okay.
Good.
Are there some things, and you've touched on this already, are there some things that you've learned about how to teach African-American children, and maybe all children, but anyway, math and science skills?
It is. And the very interesting thing is that statistics and demographics make no impression on the children or the parents. You can talk about the fact that 50% of the workforce is not going to be qualified and we're not going to be competitive and the Japanese and the rest of the world is going to outdo us all you want. That does not really make an impression on our families. What motivates our families deeply and has, I think, everything to do with the response we're getting in Say Yes to a Youngster's Future is this cultural dimension which this film and our whole approach demonstrate to you.
You said cultural dimension. What do you mean?
The fact that as African people, we are not aliens. Listervelt, if you ask Americans, people who live in the United States, what is a scientist? Describe a scientist to me. Everybody will say it's a white male over 50 with a certain kind of spectacles and maybe even a certain kind of patch on their suit jacket. Our children don't even think and therefore can't even dream of themselves in that role, and neither can their families. When I speak of dwarfed perceptions and changing the whole way that we think of our possibilities, opening up to our families and our children totally new perceptions of our possibilities in life, this is what we're getting at with this cultural context. When we let our families know that we gave the world math and science, when we give them specific information about great men like Imhotep, great civilizations like Kemet, and show specifically what grew out of those societies, some of which we don't know how to match today.
Right.
There's a new awakening. Suddenly, the blinders are off. Suddenly, it's like you unshackle people's minds, and therefore their bodies and their whole intellectual ability gets into another gear. This is what we're trying to do. You cannot teach in a vacuum. No one learns in a vacuum. And our children don't learn in isolation. You know, Listervelt, maybe this is a good time to just point this out. A very cruel, negative pathology is being perpetrated on our children and on all of us at this point in time. This business of permanent underclass, at risk, disadvantaged, it's an enormously powerful, negative, self-fulfilling prophecy that is being played out in the lives of our children every day. We throw that wet blanket right on off and say, no, indeed. You not only come from great people, you are great people. You have talent. You have genius. I see it when you do this and when you do that. It can also be applied here in the classroom. You're brilliant. You're beautiful. You're talented. And this is how we go. In other words, replacing a whole set of negative self-fulfilling prophecies with a new set of positive self-fulfilling prophecies which are rooted deep, deep down in the ancient primordial African culture which we, after all, have lost to the extent that we're willing to lose it, but can regain and can replace if we're willing to do that. And we're doing it, and it's motivating these children, their families, and their teachers in very deep ways that change their whole perceptions of their possibilities.
In your opinion, when is the African American child getting a good education?
The African American child can only get a good education in the fertile soil, in my view. And may I say that this is a personal view that I'm bringing to answer that kind of a question.
This is not the National Urban Coalition.
This is not policy, as by Rusty.
Okay.
Who's making policy? This is not policy, right?
This is not policy. Okay.
This is Ramona, the philosopher, the mother, the teacher, as well as the organizational person right now. You cannot learn in a vacuum. You cannot tell children in so many ways every day that in order for you to learn anything, you have to leave your mother. You have to leave your family and your community and go off over here and try to be like somebody else. We do not learn in a vacuum. Here again, that cultural dimension that I was speaking of. You know, occasionally we see these stories about babies who were born out in the wild and raised by wolves and all this kind of thing. They don't even have the gift of language. That's because as human creatures, we aren't born talking. We aren't born speaking English or any other language. In fact, we might not talk at all unless what? Unless someone teaches us. That's just one example of the way that all of our thoughts and perceptions and talents are developed. That's the job of a culture, is to teach you, to train you and bring you up in the way of your people to exemplify and then pass on what it is and who it is that you are. And it's key to education, religion, family structure, political structure, in terms of the government that you work in, and the economic structure, are all the pillars of a culture. We haven't put those pillars back in place. My own point of view, and this is controversial, and I like debate about things like this. My own point of view is that most African American children should be in predominantly African American settings. In elementary school, when your first identity as an intellectual being starts to be formed, and in undergraduate school, when your paradigms are set, and when your real intellectual identity is formed and nurtured.
When your paradigms are set. You're going to have to do that for Orangeburg.
Orangeburg. No, paradigm is just the preferred way of doing something. Right now,
that sounds good. That sounds good. That sounds real good. I understand that.
You understand that? A paradigm.
Go ahead.
D-I-G-M, right?
Let me say a pair of dimes. Go ahead.
Poet.
That's how I would say it in Berkeley County, South Carolina. Yeah.
I hear you. You know what a paradigm is. No, it's just a preferred way of doing things. Okay. And I'm arguing that against the Eurocentric approach to the fact that only they offer the preferred way of doing things, only they offer the paradigm. I'm saying we need a paradigm shift, which is something that they say in the academy. I agree. I admit.
All right, go ahead.
But it is necessary for us to shift that preferred way of doing things to one which grows out of our culture and celebrates us and unites us again. Right now, we have to face this system almost one by one. Even babies, kindergarten children, are put in a situation now of having to take on the whole of Western cultural dominance one by one.
Yeah. But do you think white America sees the challenge that it presents to that young child, that young African American child?
On the whole, I would say definitely not. On the whole, which is not to say that nobody sees it and nobody intends it. I don't know whether they do or not. I would not want to, present a conspiracy theory or something like that at this point. But I don't think the average American of European descent sees that particularly. But they can be made to see it. And I think the media, programs like yours, and other ways of during the civil rights movement, When they saw those fire hoses and those dogs and the hatred in Bull Connor's eyes and face and what they were willing to do to people, that mirror was inescapable for them. I don't think very many people want to look in the mirror, seriously. I certainly don't think most Europeans and European Americans want to look in the mirror seriously. But the media is a mirror. You have to look into it. And the more that the truth is portrayed and the more that the effects and the results are shown and taken back to their causes, I think the better off we'll be.
Now, you said earlier that a while ago that your personal feeling is that young African-American children need to be in predominantly African-American environment. What, school, talking about school, and you said that this was maybe a controversial.
Well, as soon as you say something like that, the first thing you hear is, well, isn't that separatist? Isn't that reverse racism? And so forth. And my response to that is unequivocal. We must develop our culture in order to sit at the table of cultures with the rest of the peoples of the world as equals. I'm not interested in being there on any other basis.
WHMM-TV salutes Mothers of Faith. Mrs. Jean Hale, mother of 7, attends Our Lady Queen of Peace Church. She's a member of the Parish Council and the Sanctuary Choir, coordinates the SHARE program, chairperson of the Finance Council, instrumental in the Southeast Pregnancy Center. Mother Gurley Mae Richards, a member of New Bethel Church of God in Christ, serves on the Mothers Board, a member of the Senior Choir, president of the Bible Band Study Class and the Helping Hand Club, served on the Usher Board for 16 years. Mrs. Geraldine Pete, devoted mother of 3 children. Mrs. Pete attends Randall Memorial Baptist Church and is a member of the Pastor's Aid Committee and the Sanctuary Choir. She also does extensive missionary work in the community. A Mother's Day salute from WHMM-TV.
Hello, I'm Judith Jamison. The most precious thing we can do for our children today is to educate them. WHMM-TV has been the most prominent entity in this community for developing, introducing, and preserving multicultural programs. With your help, WHMM can continue to bring programs that lay a foundation for future generations to build better communities. Become a member of WHMM today. Thank you.
This is membership-supported public television from Howard University, WHMM-TV.
With Dr. William Strickland, professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. We begin this segment with a quote by Dr. Strickland from an article he wrote for Essence magazine, in which he criticizes young African Americans within the so-called middle class. Quote, "Yet to their credit, many have not been taken in. Many do realize that the man cannot be trusted. So their moral is, take the money and run. But this attitude is deleterious to race unity because it produces a kind of calculating personality who believes neither in the man nor in black people. Only self has meaning. Only self is relevant. Community is simply another word for market. This perspective within the black middle class has its counterpart among black street youth, where a new predatory urban class has emerged." Yes. That's like saying, asking you to expound on that which has been expounded. But if you would.
Well, it's simply another way of saying what we discussed earlier, that in the pursuit of America, if one falls victim to the pursuit of American individualism above all things, then means and ends no longer need to be united. If making money is all that's important to me, then I can sell you drugs even though you are my brother, even though I know that drugs may kill you. And so you have that working on this drug culture. Because there's no productive economy for these people to go into, drugs have now become an industry of their own.
But is this not American individualism and glorification of money coming back to haunt the culture, the people?
All the people. Yes, of course. I mean, you have, well, this is it's a political question, but you have the recent episode with Noriega. The government of the United States has been in touch with Noriega since 1966. They've been paying him $200,000 that we know of since 1966. They then indict Noriega as a drug runner. How can they say no against, as Jesse says, how can the government say no against drugs when it in effect has alliances with international drug traffickers? How serious can people take them, you see? And what does the drug traffic mean? It's not just the hustlers on the street, which is, again, like the image they give you of Martin, one small aspect of the industry. You cannot stop drugs unless you deal with the banks that launder the money, unless you deal with the law enforcement authorities who are involved in being bribed in it. The independent countries, they claim that the Colombian cartel had enough money to buy whole countries, buy whole armies. You know? That the buying off the Coast Guard. I mean, so that the nature of stopping the drug traffic, when you're talking about an economy that creates billions of dollars, its corrupting influences are enormous, are incalculable, are maybe even incomprehensible. So that just focusing on the little black addict in the street, which is what you usually see. Usually when TV shows somebody shooting up, they very rarely show somebody white shooting up. But at any rate, that's only one aspect of the problem. You have to stop all the people and all the institutions who are making fabulous sums of money off drugs if you're serious about drugs. But if your political purpose is more important to you than the internal corruption of your citizenry, if it's more important to you to have an alliance with Noriega so that you can fight the Contras, if your ideological politics is more important to you than an alliance with international gangsters, then it's very difficult, it seems to me, for people to take such a government or such an administration seriously.
As you said earlier, you are the New England co-coordinator of the Rainbow Coalition.
Jackson campaign.
Jackson campaign. What groups make up the Rainbow Coalition?
Blacks, whites, Asians, Latinos, gays, lesbians, everybody who is for Jesse's proposition of the necessity for change in the country, and understand that change can best come about through a partnership of people who have been left out or who understand the necessity to change.
Change to what? What is, of course, it's always would be better to have him here, but to the extent that you are familiar with his vision.
You can extend him an invitation.
Done, through you. Right.
You have to eat some Puerto Rico today.
But what is that vision? What does he see the homeless people that you talked about earlier? Where would they be? Where would they be in his vision?
All right. Well, Jesse's vision is part religious and part secular. So that, like Jesus in the Bible says that you feed those who are hungry and you clothe those who are naked. And certainly a compassionate society would not have 3 million homeless people. We would not be spending money building midget man missiles or Trident submarines, we would be, as just the basic theme of Jesse's message was to invest in America, that we would take taxpayers' money, which is what it is, and instead of giving it away to this cartel of fixers in the Pentagon and elsewhere, we would spend America's money on America's people. You wouldn't give it to D'Aubusson in El Salvador. You wouldn't be giving it to the Contras. You wouldn't be giving it to Afghan guerrillas. You would take America's money and give America's money to America's people to solve America's problems. That's one aspect of it. But there's a much more important aspect, because the rainbow is a harbinger of the politics of the future. The third world is 7/8 of the world. This past week, you have a group of nations meeting, the so-called Group of Seven, who are referred to as the Western industrialized nations. Of those 7 nations, only one nation is a non-white nation, Japan. Right? But the world, as Jesse says again, most of the people in the world are not white, are not Christian, are not male, and do not speak English.
Which means what?
Which means that if America is going to provide leadership of the so-called free world, if it's going to be a leader in world affairs, it must begin by understanding the reality of most of the people who inhabit this planet, that you can't dictate to those people. You can't bully them. If you go outside this country, I mean, there are demonstrations against this country in Mexico, in South Korea. I was in Germany in March. One of the reasons Reagan moved to détente was because Gorbachev's image in Europe is superior to his image in Europe. People laugh. Oh, it's another question. But if America is going to, people do not, let me finish that point. People do not understand abroad. I've been in Africa in the last year and a half and in Europe. People do not understand how the American people can support the president whom we have supported. That's point number one. Point number two is you cannot bully the world. The way in which America has the Teddy Roosevelt carry a big stick, or making pronouncements to Mexico about what it should do about its economy, or to third world nations in general. We are not, the Lord has not chosen us to dictate to humankind, and it's certainly not to dictate to humankind in a dictatorial, arrogant, and racist way. So that the nature of anti-Americanism, the volume of anti-Americanism outside these shores is astounding. And that if we wish to get along with the majority of the people in the world who are not white, we must recognize their humanity. There is very little in the American tradition to do that.
Do you think the country is capable of introspection? Do you capable of looking at itself and examining and changing?
I think so. I think again that that's the great message of Jesse's campaign. That Jesse has the great gift of being able to demystify false explanations, of being able to explain problems to people in a way that people understand. And when they understand the problems, he thinks of himself on one level as an educator. That when people understand the real nature of their problems, he believes they will come together to change them. So there are polls that have been taken that said that about 23% of white Americans would not support Jesse, to use him as an example, if he could fly backwards and spew gold dollars from his mouth. But that means that our task is not to unite with that 23, it might be 27. Our task is to unite with the 73, with the majority of people who, as we saw in Michigan, Jesse got 55% of the vote in Michigan. As I mentioned earlier, he took the whitest state, he carried the whitest state in this country. The people are ready to fight against and overcome racism.
What was happening? What's happening in Vermont that made for that state?
Superior organization.
Superior. I thought it was the idea. I thought it was the idea they were pushing.
No, Vermont had a rainbow coalition in existence since 1984, that had stayed together since 1984, and had married local issues with the larger rainbow vision. They had there was a tradition. There was a socialist mayor of in Burlington, Vermont, a guy named Bernie Sanders. And Vermont is a place where people come from all over the country, much like as people used to go to California. But people come from all over the country to live in rustic Vermont, and the people were very, very responsive to Jesse's message, and organized in the convention and
was the state
caucuses.
going through any kind of economic
No.
trials, tribulations, whatever?
No.
Not particular. No.
Mm-hmm. No one had seen the Holy Ghost that I know of now.
What separates the Rainbow Coalition from the traditional Democratic Party?
Well, the Democratic Party is many parties. It has in it many elements. The Rainbow Coalition is composed of different groups of people, first of all, and people who, I said, subscribe to Jesse's vision of change, but there are many Rainbow people who are also Democrats, and there are many Democrats who are also Rainbow, and the influence of the Rainbow Coalition on the Democratic Party, I think, is going to become stronger and stronger and stronger. I mean, to go back to the point you raised earlier that I responded to in terms of the rightfulness, the morality of America's leadership in the world being based on its compassion for non-white peoples as opposed to brute force, the country itself is changing. The demographers tell us that with the rate of natural increase and immigration into the United States, that in less than 100 years, European descendant whites will not be the majority population in this country. America itself is undergoing change, and that's one of the things the Rainbow represents. Jesse brought into political life Asian Americans in 1984 who had never been involved in as significant a way before. He took a pariah group, a group that had been cast out, that was anathema in Arab Americans, and gave them a role in American politics for the first time. See, there are Latinos involved in the Rainbow, many of whom have recently come into this country, so that the Rainbow represents what America could become, a future partnership of people of different classes, different religions, different colors, but all of whom are wedded to the notion of making America a better society.
That point you just made, the fact that Jesse brought the Arab American into the political theater, if you will, for lack of a better word, and Jesse doing this, Jesse doing that. Who is doing anything for black people?
Who is doing anything for
I mean, you know, we've always had this big heart, you know what I mean? Who's doing anything? I mean, all that's great, but I'm just asking, you know, who's doing anything? Who's doing anything for us?
Well, I think the same people are doing things for us who've always done things for us, which is fundamentally, if anything's going to, yes, I mean, that's why Karenga had a group in California years ago called Us, right. and the press would ask him, well, what does us mean? He says, just plain us. So, but fundamentally, no other people no people in history have been freed short of their own exertions for freedom. No other people have elevated themselves or advanced themselves short of their own. Fundamentally, there may have been subsidiary alliances, but fundamentally, people have to free themselves. They have to advance themselves.
Now, let me get picky for a minute, if you will. You mentioned the word compassion earlier. Mm-hmm. That America must be able to show compassion
mm-hmm.
to other people. Is compassion what people really want?
Which people?
People around the world. The people of color that you talked about, the third world.
I think they want help.
Or do they want respect and?
I think those are not mutually exclusive. In fact,
well, I said it was picky, but go ahead.
They go together.
Go ahead.
I think it's hard. There's a difference between compassion and paternalism.
Okay, go ahead. All right.
There's a difference between compassion and paternalism, where you think we have everything, we are everything, and here are the poor benighted natives, the Gunga Din complex. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying the very difficult thing that America has to undergo, in my judgment, if you ask me what the future task of America is, to try and understand the humanity of other peoples. You get some of that from people who've been in Vietnam and who've had have tried to bring back the children that they left in Vietnam. You have whites who are adopting, although there's some people have different positions on this question. Whites who are adopting non-white children. But compassion means that you are able to identify with the other. You cannot be compassionate and racist. A racist cannot identify with you. He cannot experience your humanity. He sees you as an object, as a commodity, as a null, as a cipher, as a non-entity. So that to have compassion means that by definition that the country has grown to respect the humanity of other peoples. If you respect other people's humanity, then you can, if they are in need, and you, as the Bible said, if you have more, then one can find a way to share, as opposed to using your resources for control, but to share in the mutual development of peoples throughout this globe.
Okay. Now, the Rainbow Coalition and its vision of America. We have these homeless people in America, many people would say. We have these unemployed people, many people would say, because of the nature of the economic system that America supports, capitalism. And many people would say
they don't call it that. They call it free market enterprise.
Free market enterprise, whatever. Can the Rainbow Coalition hope to ever be in a position to put the black homeless, the black unemployed, the black poverty-stricken in a better position than the white unemployed in Appalachia over the years, not just recently? Can the Rainbow Coalition address the nature of the economic system and begin to deal with that to make meaningful changes in the countries? Is that being talked about at all?
It's certainly being talked about. Whether it can be done is an historical question we will see, or it's an empirical question. It is yet to be determined. But the need...
Is it possible to turn things around in this country for everybody without taking a hard look at the economic system?
I don't think so. I mean, I think there is no change without struggle, as Frederick Douglass said. There are people with very powerful interests who are against change. But as I said before, the fundamental experience that I would suggest of black people, that is of victimization and resistance, includes more and more people who are not black. There are people who die in this country, maybe not every day, but who are dying and have been dying because they don't have $80,000 for an organ transplant. You see, if you need an organ transplant and you can't get on this medium, you see, the question of people's compassion, that if an individual case is brought to their attention, the studies almost uniformly show the American people respond. But if you need an organ transplant and you don't have the money and you can't get on the media to publicize your case, then you die, you see? And you die whether you're black or whether you're white. So that the nature of these inequities in the system, as they affect more and more people, it seems to me it creates a constituency for change, that the system is in many ways basically unfair. But that unfairness has been explained away by the people who profit from that unfairness. To the extent that we have a political movement that explains to people that the nature of unfairness and how it impacts upon them regardless of their color, to that extent, I think we have the possibilities of realizing the rainbow vision.
How long have you known the Reverend Jesse Jackson?
I haven't, really since '84.
Mm-hmm.
I'd seen him in our paths across in movement times, but I didn't know him.
He wasn't Reverend Jesse Jackson, and you weren't.
We were doing different things. I've come to know him fundamentally since '84.
In what ways has his decision to become a politician changed his thinking? What did he give up when he decided to become a politician? Well, just before you answer that, please assume your academic. please assume your academic position.
The answer to that question is you call Jesse and invite him and answer. And you ask him that.
Because his mama couldn't be watching.
That's true. That's true. You ask him that. I think on another level, I don't think he's given up anything. I think he's expanded his vision.
What do you think? There was so much concern, as you alluded to earlier, on the part of many white Americans about the candidacy of the Reverend Jesse Jackson. What do you think Reverend Jackson represented to the white male American?
Well, I mean, I think, again, that we have Jesse, like black people in general, frighten some people. And
say that again now. Let me.
I said Jesse, like black people, like black people in general, do frighten some white Americans. I mean, they have these. There are these Bernard Getz in New York, who had been mugged before, and then took an attitude against black youth in general, so that he went looking for trouble, it would appear, so that the myth of the black as the stereotype of blacks as rapists, as muggers, as criminals, as a foreign body, you see, because we lack experience of one another on the levels of equity. It is very easy, well, it's difficult for people to overcome certain kinds of stereotypes. I think that some people just can't imagine a world where there would be a black president. I alluded to the study before, with something between 23 and 27%, so they could never, I mean, if Jesse were Jesus, they wouldn't be able to vote for him. I don't think there's anything we can do for those people. Maybe in years to come, they can see that, Tom Bradley's been mayor of Los Angeles, the world hasn't come to an end. Andy Young is mayor of Atlanta, which is slightly different because the racial composition is different. Colin Powell is the National Security Advisor. America's defense postures and foreign policy has not undergone fundamental change, which may be a critique of Colin Powell. One doesn't know. But we have sufficient that the #1 media personality in this country is Bill Cosby. Television has not gone under. That many of the major cultural figures in this country, crossover, Lionel Richie, etc., the world hasn't come to an end. So that over time, the kinds of stereotypes and the kinds of prejudices that certain elements of our country foster can be seen, many people can overcome them. And I think that's the hope of the future, but certainly some people who are just afraid of Jesse as president.
Jesse Jackson, he's dealing in another area, and that realm is power.
Yes, hopefully.
As opposed to Lionel Richie and Bill Cosby, who has plenty of money, but I think
that's what he can.
All right.
Carr supported the proposition.
But doesn't that element, though, that power element,
I think so, sure.
Search for power.
Black people are not supposed to have power in the country, sure.
Mm-hmm.
They're not supposed to have power in South Africa, not supposed to have power here. I mean, ultimately, America, it just is not in the tradition of America to see somebody have power at that level.
Do you think that we talk to black children enough about power, what it means, how you should get it, how you should handle it?
Well, the different kinds of power, you see. What Martin and Gandhi and the movement had was moral power. And what the South Africa struggle has, it has moral power. We have to be careful. Power, when people say power in America, they tend to mean power to do things to people or to impose your will upon people. There are all kinds of power. I think I'm making a philosophical argument that it is better to be good than evil. There is no guarantee that being good will save you.
Okay.
You see? There's no guarantee that being good will save you. But as I understand the values to which this country is supposed to subscribe, that we should, and if I understand the religious message of Christianity and indeed of Buddhism and of Islam, that man should strive to be good. Man, woman, humankind should strive to be good. So the Indians did the best they could for their day, just as we should do the best we can for our day. There is no guarantee, however, in life that because you do the best thing or the correct thing, that you will triumph. But we need to do it anyway, because the alternative is an immoral, unprincipled, parasitic, carnivorous people, not worthy of its history and traditions.
And I thank you, sir. Dr. Strickland, thank you very much.
Thank you, brother.
A production of the South Carolina Educational Television Network.
And good evening to you. When we decided that our last program for this month of Black History celebration would deal with African history, only 1/4 of the problem was solved. 3/4 of the problem included questions such as what person could do more than scratch the surface of this crucial and central part of world history, and finally, what person could bring the kind of enthusiasm to this topic that would hold your interest. Well, all arrows pointed to Egyptologist Dr. Yosef Benyekinen. Dr. Benyekinen is professor of history and Egyptology at Cornell University and professor of history at Temple University. Some of his books include Black Man of the Nile, Africa, Mother of Western Civilization, and The Need for a Holy Bible. Dr. Benyekinen, what do we know about Africa as the birthplace of civilization?
I think most people know very little about it. However, if you look at Africa from numerous ways in terms of the birthplace of civilization, one has to go back into archaeology, into anthropology, and then next into theology. In the case of anthropology, we would have the oldest known fossil human, Zinjanthropus boise, which will take us to at least 1.7 million years ago. That would mean approximately 1.7 million years before Adam and Eve. If we look into archaeology, we can go back into looking at the buildings such as the Step Pyramid of Saqqara, the places where the silt pyramids were first built, the movement of the Nile Valley in terms of the cataracts, and lastly, if we look from a theosophical point of view, we will have to go back into the teachings of the Africans and African gods and goddesses that predated Jehovah, Jesus, and Allah, and that would put us at least to the worship of Ta, P-T-A-H, subsequently the worship of Amen-Ra, A-M-E-N-R-A, and goddess Hathor, H-A-T-H-O-R, whom the Hebrews copied and called the golden calf and the golden this and that, the other thing.
Sometimes you hear people say that Africa is not only the birthplace of civilization, but the birthplace of man. Would you address this, please?
Certainly.
The oldest known fossil man found in Europe is called Neanderthal man, and it's only dated approximately 200,000 to 400,000 years of age. The next would be, they call it Pekin man or Java man. That would be dated somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 years old. However, the oldest known fossil man will go back to some names they have not even been able to give yet, but Ethiopian man fossil will carry us back to approximately 3.5 million years. There is a Tanganyika fossil over 2 million years, and of course Zinjanthropus boise, which is at least 1.7 million years old, meaning then that the oldest known human fossil have been unearthed, dug up, in a place called Tanganyika, in an area called Ngorongoro Crater and Olduvai Gorge. Now that is it. The oldest known human has been dug up in Africa.
I guess what I'm trying to get to is, you know, if all mankind was born in Africa, how do we account for the distribution throughout the world?
Well, number one, there is a common land bridge between Africa, Asia, and Europe. Before the Suez Canal was dug by human beings in the 19th century, there was a land bridge there at the Sinai so that men could travel back and forth. However, the problem comes as to South America, and if you were to look at the landfall there, you'll notice that if you push Brazil, you can push it right into Ghana and the Bight of Benin there. Now that's a theory, of course. However, we do know